most welcome to 1089 of the Heidegger series. We will continue today with Heraclitus, and we were just getting into differences between sleep and wake and the state of being dead and not dead. Athanatos, Thanatos. This weird statement from Heraclitus that the dead should be thrown out quicker than done, which is sacrilegious at the time, blasphemous. So we'll try to see if we can put some light into many of these weirdnesses that comes from Heraclitus and his incredibly odd take compared to the other philosophers, sophists, and physicos at the time. Continue on page 220. Just mentioned earlier that they found some gold tablets of Turin in South Italy with the following inscription: "Fortunate and most blessed, you will be a god instead of a mortal period." Now they claim that a mortal may become a god, however presumptuous it may sound in the 5th century, has at least a mythic precedent in the story of Heraclitus' acceptance among the Olympians. The related thesis that this human life is in reality the death of a higher being is much more esoteric. Again, we find a hint of such a view in the Purifications of Empedocles, where the body is described as an alien garment of flesh, and birth seems to be referred to as the unwelcome arrival in an unfamiliar place, to be greeted by funeral cries and lamentation. Even closer to the aforementioned paragraph 112 can be found in Attic literature. Who knows if life be death, but death in turn be recognized below as life? This is from Euripides. Plato himself quotes these Euripidean verses in the Orgias as evidence for the view that perhaps we are truly dead, and he speaks in this connection of a doctrine that regards the body, soma, as the tomb of sema, the soul. This is not the place to discuss the origins and ramifications of this non-standard view of the human psyche. My point was simply to illustrate the affinity of language between 112 and certain mystic doctrines associated with the so-called Orphic, or more accurately Pythagorean tradition. But it does not follow from the fact that Heraclitus uses the language of this tradition that he accepts the view of the psyche which it implies. The monistic tendency of his own thought is really incompatible with the doctrine of an individual psyche migrating from body to body. Heraclitus makes use of this mystic language in part for its shock effect, to suggest the drastic novelty of his own insight into the unity of life and death, the radically unexpected truth that awaits man beyond the grave. 13. The same, living and dead, and the walking and the sleeping, and the young and the old. For these transposed are those, and those transposed again are these. As we get more mysterious, I'd say. As a basis for the interpretation of 113, I recall the two complementary principles enunciated above. One, the reversibility of the process of death by analogy with the alternation of sleeping and walking, and with the return of the seasons of the year. Two, the generalization of the notion of death, conceived as any change of state in which something old gives way before something radically new. The first thesis implied by 112 is here stated explicitly. The corresponding generalization or relativization of the concept of death, which seems implicit in both 112 and 113, is more directly documented by 102, D36 in parenthesis, to have a reference. If we take the reference to the death of water and the earth quite literally. Both the literal interpretation of 102 and the generalized notion of death are entailed by the panpsychism I have attributed to Heraclitus on the basis on D113 and D45. By the usual, parenthesis, by the usual hermeneutical circle, this attribution is now confirmed by its application to 112 and 113 and 102. And of course, some unity between life and death, including some positive evaluation of the negative term, follows from Heraclitus's central conception of the harmony or fitting together of opposites, as we see in the discussion of D51 and D48. What remains to be shown is how these various doctrines are connected in a coherent view of life beyond death for the human being or for the psyche. It is natural to begin with a comparison with the Pythagorean doctrine of transmigration, for this must have served as a point of departure for Heraclitus' own view of the afterlife. The Pythagorean doctrine satisfied my principle of reversibility by positing a process of rebirth in a new body as the converse of dying when the psyche leaves its previous body. It also involves a relativization of the notion of death, insofar as birth and death are both interpreted as a change of state for the psyche rather than as a radical coming to be and passing away. To this extent, there is a genuine affinity between Heraclitus' thought and the mystic view of the soul, which justify the affinity of language already noted. But the Pythagorean doctrine implies a basic disparity between the destiny of the deathless psyche and that of the mortal body, and hence a fundamental dualism between the realms of the animate or deathless and the inanimate or mortal. It is precisely here that Heraclitus' view diverges in virtue of his monism. which in this context means his panpsychism, and his extension of the notion of death to any radical change of state. The statement of 102 or D36 that the psyche which dies is reborn as water, and the water which dies is reborn as earth, can be seen as a generalization of the doctrine of transmigration for the whole cycle of elemental transformations, in which every stage is simultaneously a death and a rebirth. Thus Heraclitus has extended the Pythagorean cycle of rebirth to the general Milesian conception of elemental coming to be and passing away, expressed in the fragment of Anaximander. Since the Pythagoreans themselves has emphasized the continuity between different forms of life, human, animal, vegetable, their view could be formulated by Plato as the claim that all nature is Akin. The panpsychism of Heraclitus is perhaps best understood as an insistence upon taking this claim literally, together with a willingness to draw the most radical consequences from it for the interpretation of human destiny. As 93 indicates by the parallel to waking and sleeping, youth and age, and the claim that all these are the same, the alternation of the psychic death and rebirth in a new form, by which the dead become the living, and these are transposed as those, is then only a special case of the general law of nature, with its rhythmic alternation between opposite poles, as in the mutual succession of night and day, the aniotropa of the sun and seasons. This was perfectly understood by Plato, who introduces the doctrine of rebirth of souls from the dead in Phaedo, as a conclusion from the more general theory concerning all animals and plants and all things that have coming to be, Genesis, a theory which argues an impeccable Heraclitean form that in every case they come to be as opposites from opposites, and in no other way. This is from Phaedo 70d to E. Now the natural objection to this generalized view of immortality and the reversibility of death, an objection which the mystic doctrine of reincarnation seeks to avoid, is that it is always something new that is reborn, and not the same entity as before, just as yesterday and tomorrow are not the same day, and last summer and next summer are not the same season. So will never be the same man who after growing old becomes young again, nor will it be the same human being who can hope to be reborn after his death. Therefore, this objection runs: there is a crucial disanalogy between these cases and phenomena like sleeping and waking, where the psyche undergoes a fundamental change of state, but remains one and the same throughout. The analogy articulated in 93 thus fails to take account of the central feature of personal identity and the fact of psychophysical continuity established both by memory and by bodily persistence between the man awake and his former self asleep, as between the waking man now and his earlier waking state. But there is no comparable identity or continuity between the man living and the man dead, except for the persistence of his bodily components in their slow return to the elements, and none at all between the old man and some future state of youth. Consequently, the principle of reversibility posited by the analogy to sleep fails utterly in the case of death and aging. Any hope of survival or revival which rests upon this analogy must be fallacious and can offer no real consolation either for our individual death or for our experience of diminution in old age. This objection is definitely a crucial one, and the answer to it will bring out more clearly the radical nature of Heraclitus' thought about life and death. For his answer must take the form of a fundamental denial of the notions of personal and psychic identity as ordinarily conceived. I think there is no doubt that Heraclitus would confidently reject the charge of fallacy and would insist that the alleged this analogy is a snare and an illusion. In reality, neither our bodies nor our psyches are, in the strictest sense, ever one and the same from moment to the next. They are continually undergoing radical transformation, dying and being reborn again at every instant. Well, just listen to Julian Barber. Every microsecond we are a new creation. Once more, Plato has rendered Heraclitus' thought with complete fidelity in the passage already cited from the Symposium, page 167. But let the old riddler speak for himself. As they step into the same rivers, other and still other waters flow upon them. The identity of the river is one of form and physical continuity, but not a material identity or preservation of the same content. And as a reference to men stepping in makes clear, this coexistence of continuity with a massive change is understood in terms of human experience of a world that is fundamentally stable but never really the same. If you look for a strict identity, you cannot step twice in the same river. That is to say, the lack of identity between one day or one summer and the next is exactly paralleled by the lack of identity between one moment of our experience and another moment of our experience of the same thing. Isn't that brilliant? That is very sharp of Kahn. Even in the case of personal continuity between the sleeping and waking man, between the dream self and the everyday self, the relationship is one of psychic contiguity or contact, not strict identity. The walking touches haptetai, the sleeping in memory, as the living sleeper touches the dead in dreaming. Thus, there is just as much or just as little unity and identity between a man and his dreams, between a man and his past self and past experiences, as between a man and his offspring, or between a man and his lasting fame. And just as much as little identity between one elemental form and its successor, or between the river today and the river tomorrow. Still, the objection has not been fully answered. For if we understand, as I think we must, the Heraclitean river of flux doctrine in the way that has just been indicated, the objector may respond as follows. Even if there is no such thing as absolute identity over time for individual persons or objects, nevertheless there are different grades of relative identity. In the case of persons, there is first the phenomena of physical continuity from time to time, from place to place, for a body of the same general form with massive overlap of the same material constituents from one interval to the next. The kind of identity over time which human beings share with physical objects such as stones and trees, and which last beyond their death as long as the body remains more or less intact. I think once more we have to mention Julian Barber, because he explains so clearly that identity is a common myth, and we all know that. We all die each moment and we are getting reborn each other moment. Well, at least if we are stuck in the physicos idea, we invite death for every moment. And I think he actually put in a remark against eternal life for that reason. And I think that's a necessary conclusion if you start with the physikos idea. So Heraclitus saves us both from the momentarily death of the moment and the eternal death of the life. And this is also more or less clearly shown in the Milgram experiment that are repeated today. Very few men or women stick very hard to religious truth these days. This is so unusual, it's much less than 0.1%. The reason being, obviously, now we can calculate. And if we start from the physicals, have no idea about Heraclitus, there is only one solution, and that is death in each moment and death of life. I think this makes Heraclitus even more interesting and necessary, I would say, as well. Very hard to see how these things could sort of calculate themselves by themselves. It's just beyond belief. It just won't happen. This conclusion, if you use normal thinking, so to speak, not Heraclitean, not philosophical thinking, the conclusion is necessary that there is no life beyond death, because there is not even life from moment to moment. Of course, this makes Heraclitus even bigger than I previously indicated. Gracias. And there's also the fact of psychological continuity with the same self in the past and in the future. This psychic continuity, which we tend to think of as distinctly human, though it must be shared to some extent by other animals as well, presumably, connects me with my past self not only by explicit memories, but also by entire patterns of habits, skills, preference, nostalgias, phobias, and recurrent moods. By the entire pattern of my personality as a legacy from childhood and adolescence, down to my delightful or irritating experience of yesterday or of 5 minutes ago. On the other hand, this same psychic continuity connects me with my future self not only by the persistence, more or less unchanged, of this elaborate pattern from the past, but also by the constant projection of myself into the future, by way of hopes and fears for tomorrow, by long and short-term plans for actions, ambitions, and for future achievements and rewards, foreboding of future losses. Including the death of those dear to me, and also my own death. A whole range of prepared responses for coming contingencies of all sorts. Now the importance of the first concept, the thought of physical or bodily continuity beyond death, is reflected in all the immense variety of ancient funeral cult and grave adornment, but most strikingly in the Egyptian practice of mummification, designed precisely to preserve the recognizable form of an individual body. On the other hand, the psychic continuity beyond death is presupposed, in some sense, by all concerned with the future of one's fame and of one's family, including perhaps the concerns for one's own burial, as if one were to be among the spectators, or for a future remembrance in the regular tending of one's grave. But in this perspective, the most striking expression of the concern for future psychic continuity, corresponding in principle to the practice of mummification for the preserving of bodily identity, is the Pythagorean doctrine of recollection of previous existences, with the corresponding importance in the eschatology of the South Italian rule tablets, on the promise of a drink from the waters of memory, the cool drink from the lake of Mnemosyne in the world below, that will permit the dead to retain the essential psychic contact with his personal past in the future state that awaits him. Such is our ordinary pre-philosophic concept of personal identity, or individual survival in its double form, bodily and psychic. Quite distinct is our notion of generic or specific identity, as one horse or one tree is replaced by another, or when parents are replaced by children who becomes parents in turn of successive generations. It is a notion of generic survival, or replacement in kind, that is exemplified by the sequence of days and seasons. and in a different way also by the waters that are continually being replaced within a given river. Finally, there is a third and again different notion of replacement or survival, in which the principle of generic identity or likeness of kind is given up. As when plants are consumed by animals, or when dung and corpses are reabsorbed into earth, and the elements, or when one element such as water yields to another element such as earth, according to Heraclitus' own doctrine. Here, there in a certain notion of physical continuity from one state to the next, and a regular sequence of stages, but no sense in which any likeness of kind or definite form is preserved. Our objection against Heraclitus' view of the interchange of living and dead, young and old, can now be reformulated as the claim that he systematically blurs the distinction between these three kinds of survival, characterized by 1. Some preservation of psychic or bodily individuality, 2. The maintenance or recurrence of the same generic form, 3. The regularity in the sequence of changes with some continuity between stages, but no preservation of individual or even generic identity. What men ordinarily desire is individual survival in the first sense, which is promised to them in some measure by the various grave cults of antiquity, and even by the dismal Homeric picture of the psyche as phantoms of men in the world below, but which finds its most perfect fulfillment in the mystic promise of future bliss, whether pagan or Christian. It is in the second form, generic survival or replacement by another individual of the same kind, which is represented in the desire for offspring and the practice of naming a male child after the grandfather or some other older relative. However, if Heraclitus' generalization of the notion of death is taken seriously, so that the death of water and the birth of earth are to be regarded as strictly parallel to the death and birth of an individual human being, this has the effect of reducing the first two forms of survival to the third. The third form of continuity in change is mere transformation, the production of something new with the annihilation of what has gone before, so that neither individual survivor nor likeness of kind is maintained. To this natural objection, I believe that the true Heraclitean response will be, "You have entirely misunderstood my doctrine. Yes, I do reduce all sorts of change and survival to one type, but it is to the second and not the third. To likeness of kind and identity of structure, which the river illustrates by preserving its form, while all the individuating matter has been replaced. The river as a concrete individual is ever dying and being reborn as other and again other waters are ever pouring in. And this identity of pattern holds generally for the nature as whole. It includes the contrast structure of the year, within which the seasons change, as well as the constant unit of night and day, within which the relative length of the night and of the day will vary according to seasons. So even if, as I am willing to grant, Anaximander or some other theorist was right to suppose that the formation of the world will be balanced in time by its destruction, so that the ruling principle of fire will eventually consume all things in a regular exchange between itself as fire and itself as cosmos. Even so, the unity of the whole pattern will be preserved, within which all the parts must change and recur with likeness of kind. In short, the only identical individual is the cosmic process as whole, with its cycle of recurrence over the longest year, whatever time and pattern in this cycle of transformation may take. But its unity of structure is guaranteed by the regular recurrence of the same forms, by likeness of kind as defined by the permanent tension and rhythmic alternation between opposites at every level, from individual birth and death to the daily lightning and quenching of the sun, from the birth and death of the elements to the eternal kindling and extinction of cosmic fire. This is the sense of personal identity and personal survival which I have come to recognize, the unity of all things in the wise one alone, which I found when I set out in search of myself." End quote. Thus it is the recognition of this common pattern in the part and the whole, the universal law of polar tension, and the regular pendulum swinging back and forth between opposites, the endless recurrence of ever-living fire in the same forms, which provides the only consolation there is or could be for human aging and death. Perhaps the greatest surprise that awaits us at our death is that the things will not be very different, since we are and always have been familiar with the experience of continually dying and continually being reborn. Not bad. Then we have a quote 94, or D52. "Lifetime, Ion, is childhood play, moving pieces in a game. Kingship belongs to the child." My own solution to this most enigmatic of Heraclitian riddles is indicated by the translation of Perseon as moving pieces in a game, where this is understood as an echo of things transpose, meta pesonta. What was there said to be moved back and forth was living and dead, and the waking and the sleeping, and the young and the old. Such reversals constitute the very principle of cosmic order. More specifically, these three pairs define the structure of human experience as an alternating pattern of being kindled and going out. On my view, the fundamental thought is not the childlike and random movement of the game, but the fact that these moves follow a definite rule, so that after one side plays, it is the other's turn. And after the victory is reached, the play must start over from the beginning. The rules of the Pessoa game thus imitate the alternating measure of cosmic fire. My interpretation assumes a continuity of thought and imagery between 93 and 94, D88 and D52. This continuity would be guaranteed if we could be sure the game of Pessoa in 94 involved the use of dice, like the modern tally or backgammon. For the word metapesein, or transpositions, in 93 has the literal sense of fall out otherwise, and could immediately suggest the fall of a die. But wherever or not we bring dice into this game, the verb metapesen will remain relevant to 94, since it is a synonym of other words like meta tifena and metabalen that typically describe moving pieces on a board. If we agree then to take the back and forth movement of 93 with its cosmic and human applications as a clue for understanding the peso game in 94, we are left with 3 puzzles to unravel. 1. Why is the player named Ion, lifetime? 2. Why is he called a child at play, Paisan? 3. Why is the child described as a king? Any answer to 2 is likely to seem conjectural. The first and the third puzzles admit of rather straightforward solutions. 1. Aeon has the sense of vitality, human life, as when Pindar calls the soul the image of the man's Ion. On this sense, it's based on the standard uses of the word for lifetime, duration of a life, which, under the influence of the cognate verb ia, always, forever, eventually makes Ion a synonym for time.